I don't believe in ghosts. Never have. I think people just get too caught up in dark places, let their minds run wild, and suddenly every shadow looks like a figure standing in the corner. I've always liked proving people wrong, especially when it comes to stuff like that. That's how I ended up alone in the abandoned subway. It started as a stupid bet. My friend Mark and I had been watching some urban explorer videos, the kind where people sneak into old buildings or tunnels and find creepy stuff. One of them was about the Ashbury station, a subway stop that had been shut down decades ago. It was supposed to be sealed off, but people online claimed there were ways in. Maintenance tunnels, old stairwells, even forgotten service doors. And, of course, there were stories. Some said people had gone in and never come out. Others swore they had heard voices or seen lights moving in the dark. One guy in a forum claimed the station was still operating, but for passengers who don't belong in this world. Mark dared me to go. At first, he was supposed to come too. But as soon as we got close to one of the supposed entry points, a rusted service door at the far end of an abandoned train yard, he backed out. Said he had a bad feeling. Told me I was insane for even thinking about it. I called him a coward, laughed it off, and went in alone. The service door wasn't even locked, just stuck like it hadn't been used in years. I had to yank it hard, and when it finally gave way, the metal screamed against the hinges, echoing down into the darkness. The air inside was thick, heavy. It smelled stale, like old dirt and rusted metal. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the dark. The tunnel ahead of me stretched deep, lined with cracked tiles, exposed pipes, and old maintenance signs covered in dust. Some of them were faded so badly, I could barely make out the words. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The deeper I went, the more wrong everything felt. It wasn't just the darkness. It was the silence. There was no sound of dripping water, no rats scurrying in the shadows. Even my own footsteps sounded muffled, like the walls were swallowing the noise. I kept walking, following the old tunnel. My plan was simple: get to the station, take some pictures, prove there was nothing there, and get out. Then I heard it. A footstep. Not mine. It came from somewhere behind me, faint but unmistakable. I froze, listening. My heart pounded, and for the first time, I felt something close to fear. I turned my flashlight back the way I came. Nothing. Just the empty tunnel stretching behind me. But the air felt heavier, like something was standing just out of sight, watching. I told myself it was just my nerves, just an echo. I kept walking. After what felt like forever, I finally saw it, the entrance to Ashbury Station. The old archway still had the station's name engraved in stone above it, though most of the letters had crumbled away. The stairs leading down were cracked, covered in grime, and something dark that looked almost like soot. I swallowed hard and descended. The station itself was empty. The old platform stretched ahead, lined with cracked columns and faded advertisements from decades ago. The tracks were still there, but rusted over, disappearing into the dark tunnels on either side. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, but I felt something, a pressure in the air, a weight on my chest. I walked along the platform, my footsteps echoing weirdly. The walls were covered in graffiti, but a lot of it looked off. Some of the symbols didn't make sense, and some of the words were in a language I didn't recognize. Then I saw the train. It sat on the tracks, its metal surface covered in dust. An old subway car, long abandoned. It looked like it had been there for years untouched. But the weird thing was, there were footprints in the dust, leading inside. Fresh footprints. I felt a shiver run through me. I lifted my flashlight, aiming it at the car's open doors. The inside was dark, the seats ripped apart, the floor covered in dirt and old newspapers. But it was the silence that got me. It was too quiet, like the whole station was holding its breath. I hesitated at the entrance. Part of me wanted to turn back, to leave, go home, and tell Mark he was right. But then I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost too soft to hear, coming from inside the train, and the doors slid open wider, like they were inviting me in. I should have left, right then and there. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was that part of my brain that refused to believe in ghosts, in curses, in all the nonsense people tell each other to scare themselves. Maybe it was something else. The whisper had been so faint, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But the way the train doors slid open, smooth, almost expectant, it made my stomach clench. I stood there, staring into the dark interior, my flashlight beam shaking just a little in my grip. The footprints in the dust led inside. I hesitated, then stepped in. The air inside was different, thicker, stale, and electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. The seats were old, ripped apart, their stuffing spilling onto the floor. The metal poles had long since rusted. A few newspapers were scattered on the ground, the pages yellowed and brittle. I bent down, picking one up. The date was smudged, unreadable, but the front page headline made my skin crawl. Commuters vanish on last train of the night. I dropped the paper. The whisper came again, closer this time. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the rows of seats. Empty. Dust floated in the beam, disturbed by my movement. The doors behind me were still open. I could leave. I could turn back, forget this stupid bet, and tell Mark he was right. Then, the doors slammed shut. I lunged for them, fingers digging into the metal, but they didn't budge. I hit the emergency button next to them. Nothing. No response. A deep hum filled the car. The lights overhead flickered once. Then, with a slow, mechanical groan, the train lurched forward. I staggered, grabbing onto one of the poles. My stomach flipped. This was impossible. The tracks outside were rusted over, the station abandoned for decades. But the train was moving. I turned toward the front of the car, my heart hammering. Maybe someone was driving it. Maybe this was some kind of underground maintenance system I didn't know about. Maybe. The window to the conductor's cabin was black. Not just dark, but empty, like looking into a space where light didn't exist. The train picked up speed. The station outside blurred past. Then, nothing but tunnel. I stumbled down the aisle, trying to keep my balance. The windows showed nothing but blackness. No lights, no tunnels, no walls. Just a vast, endless dark, stretching out in every direction. The whisper came again. This time, it came from the far end of the car. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The seats were empty. I was alone, but something was different. A few rows ahead, one of the seats had changed. The dust was gone. The fabric looked new, like someone had just been sitting there. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move forward. A small object sat on the seat. It was a ticket. I reached out and picked it up. The paper felt thick, old, the ink slightly faded, but the writing was clear. Admit one. One-way trip. No return. My fingers clenched around it. A loud knock echoed from the back of the car. I whirled around. There was no one there. The knock came again. Slow, deliberate. It was coming from the doors leading to the next car. My mouth went dry. I took a shaky step toward the door. The small window in its center was fogged over, smeared with dirt. My reflection in it was pale, eyes wide. The knock came one more time. Then, slowly, the dirt on the window began to smear away from the other side. I couldn't breathe. A handprint appeared. Not mine. The lights flickered again. For a split second, as the car went dark, I saw something standing just beyond the door. Tall, thin, arms too long, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then the light snapped back on, and the window was empty, but the door handle began to turn. I backed away fast, heart slamming against my ribs. The handle twisted, clicking open. The door slid an inch open, a thin gap of darkness waiting on the other side. Something breathed. I ran. I didn't think. I just bolted, shoving past the old seats, nearly tripping as I reached the door leading back to the first car. My hand scrabbled at the handle. Locked. A sharp creak behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was stepping through that gap. My fingers found the emergency release lever. I yanked it down. The doors flew open, and I jumped. I hit the ground hard, rolling onto the tracks. The train kept moving, disappearing into the tunnel ahead, its lights flickering as it was swallowed by the dark. I lay there, gasping, my body aching from the fall. The tunnel stretched out in both directions, silent. The station was gone. I pushed myself up, turning in a slow circle. No sign of where I had come from. No service door. No stairs. Just endless tunnel. And in the distance, somewhere deep in the dark, a faint whisper, coming closer. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The whisper was coming from deep in the tunnel, echoing off the walls. It wasn't words, not exactly, but it had a rhythm, something close to speech. It rose and felt like someone talking just out of earshot, and it was getting closer. I turned in circles, trying to find something, anything, that looked familiar. A sign, a stairwell, a maintenance door. But there was nothing, just the tunnel stretching into the dark. The ground was damp beneath my hands, the air thick with the scent of dust and something metallic. I wasn't supposed to be here. I tried my phone. No signal. The battery was fine, but when I opened my map app, it wouldn't load. Just a spinning circle, like it was struggling to connect to something that didn't exist. The whispering grew louder. I shined my flashlight down the tunnel, my hands shaking. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sign of what was making the sound. Then the whisper stopped. Silence. The kind that pressed in, that made your heartbeat sound too loud in your ears. Then, behind me, crunch, a footstep. I spun around so fast I almost dropped my phone. The tunnel behind me was empty. But the ground, the dust had been disturbed. A single footprint had appeared, fresh, like someone had just stepped forward. I backed away. My breath came fast and shallow. I pointed my flashlight at the ground, scanning for more prints. Another one appeared, right in front of me. The dust shifted, the shape pressing into the dirt, as if an invisible foot had just stepped down. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care if I tripped on the uneven tracks. I just ran. The tunnel blurred around me, my own footsteps slamming against the ground, echoing too loudly. Something moved in the corner of my vision. I turned my flashlight toward it. For a split second, I saw something. A figure. Tall, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its head slightly tilted. But before I could focus, before my brain could process what I was looking at, the light flickered, and it was gone. I kept running. The tunnel stretched on forever, but then, finally, up ahead, I saw something. A station. But it wasn't Ashbury. The platform was different, the walls covered in tiles I didn't recognize. The name on the sign was smeared, the letters half gone, but the ones that remained sent a cold wave through me. Uri Station. Ashbury? No. The letters were older. The style was different. This station wasn't the same one I had entered, but it was my only way out. I climbed onto the platform, my legs shaking. The tiles beneath my feet were damp. The whole place smelled old, like a basement that hadn't been aired out in years. I turned in a slow circle, my flashlight beam sweeping across the empty platform. No exits, no stairwells, just a single train sitting on the tracks. I didn't want to get on. Every part of me screamed to stay away, but there was nowhere else to go. I stepped forward. The train doors opened on their own. Inside, the seats were clean, new, like they had been waiting for me. A sign above the door blinked to life. Next stop, home. But the word home flickered. For a split second, It changed. Next stop. Nowhere. The doors slid open wider. And something laughed. Not loud. Not obvious. Just a soft, breathy sound. Somewhere deep in the train. Waiting. I took a step back. The whisper started again. Not from the train this time. From the tunnel behind me. Getting closer. I had two choices. Go back. Into the darkness. Into whatever was following me. Or get on the train. The doors began to close. I made my choice. I stepped inside. And the doors locked behind me. The second the doors locked behind me, I knew I'd made a mistake. The air inside the train was different. Still, but too still, like the whole car was holding its breath. The seats were clean, untouched. The floor was smooth, polished. It didn't match the decay of the station outside. The lights overhead flickered once. The train lurched forward. I grabbed onto the nearest pole, my breath coming fast. The movement was smooth, unnatural, like the train wasn't running on old tracks, but on something else entirely. The windows were black. Not dark black, like there was nothing outside at all. No tunnels. No walls. Just emptiness. The overhead screen blinked again. Next stop. Home. The word home flickered. I walked slowly down the aisle. The train felt wrong. Not just empty, but like it had never been full in the first place. Like the seats weren't meant to hold people. I tried the emergency door at the front of the car. Locked. Tried the door leading to the next car. It slid open smoothly. The next car was exactly the same. Same pristine seats. Same polished floor. The only difference, a man was sitting in one of the seats. I froze. He sat near the middle of the car, dressed in an old suit. His hands rested on his lap, fingers twitching slightly, like he was waiting for something. His face was turned away, staring at the dark window. I swallowed, my pulse pounding in my ears. I cleared my throat. Hey. No reaction. I took a cautious step closer. The air felt colder. Do you know where this train is going? I asked. Slowly, the man turned his head. His face was blurred. Not just in shadow, blurred like a smudged photograph. His features shifted slightly, unfocused, like my eyes couldn't process them properly. His mouth opened. A whisper came out. Not his voice. The same whisper I'd heard in the tunnels. I stumbled back. My flashlight shook in my hands. The man stood up, not naturally, jerky, like a puppet being lifted by invisible strings. His legs straightened, then his arms. His head tilted too far to the side, almost as if his neck had no bones. The whispering grew louder. I ran. I bolted through the car, yanking open the next door. Another train car. Same empty seats. But this time, more people were sitting in them. Not moving. Not looking at me. Their faces were all blurred. I staggered backward, my chest tight. My breath came in short, panic gasps. The whisper surrounded me now, coming from every direction. Then, at the far end of the car, one of the figures stood up, then another, then another. I turned and slammed through the door behind me. The first car was different now. The seats weren't clean anymore. They were rotting. The floor was damp, covered in something dark and sticky. The overhead lights flickered wildly. The screen above the door changed. Next stop. Last stop. The train lurched, throwing me off balance. I grabbed a seat to keep from falling, but the fabric crumbled under my fingers like dried skin. I forced myself to keep moving. The emergency door at the front of the car was still locked. I banged on it, my breath coming in ragged gulps. Let me out. A knock came from the other side. Soft, gentle. Then, slowly, the door began to unlock. Click, click, click. I backed away. The whispering stopped, and then the door swung open. I wasn't looking at a conductor's cabin. I was looking at a tunnel that shouldn't have been there. It stretched forward, uneven and jagged, the walls pulsing like they were breathing. The ground was slick, covered in a thin layer of black water that reflected the flickering train lights. The air that came through was warm, wrung, and in the distance, something was moving. I didn't have a choice. I stepped forward, and the train vanished behind me. The second I stepped off the train, the doors slammed shut behind me. I turned, heart hammering, and watched as the train flickered like a dying light bulb. Then it was gone. Just gone. No sound, no fading into the distance. 1 second it was there, and the next I was alone in the tunnel. The air was thick, humid, pressing against my skin. The walls of the tunnel weren't normal. They were wrong, uneven. They almost looked organic, like they had been carved out of something that was once alive. The thin layer of black water beneath my feet rippled slightly, as if something had just moved through it. I forced myself to breathe. There had to be a way out. I turned my flashlight down the tunnel. The light didn't reach far, maybe 10 feet before the darkness swallowed it whole. My footsteps echoed in strange ways, like the space around me was too big, too empty. I walked. The whispering started again. It came from all around me now, moving like a shifting wind. Some of the voices were low, almost chanting. Others were higher, sharp and quick. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but they sounded closer than before. I picked up my pace. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, curving slightly. The ground sloped downward. I didn't want to go deeper, but I had no choice. The path behind me was gone. The walls had shifted, closing off the way I had come. I swallowed my panic and kept moving. After what felt like forever, I saw it. A light. It flickered at the end of the tunnel, dim and unsteady. Not fluorescent, not like the subway lights. It was warmer, almost like firelight. I walked toward it, the whispering growing fainter with every step. The tunnel opened up into a station. At least, I thought it was a station at first. The platform was there, but the walls were covered in old, faded posters. They were peeling, but the faces on them, they looked wrong. Stretched, twisted. Some of them had no eyes, just smooth skin where the socket should have been. Others had their mouths open in silent screams, frozen in place like they had been caught mid-howl. The overhead sign flickered, buzzing weakly. It didn't say a station name. It only said, "End of the line." I turned in a slow circle. There were turnstiles, but they were bent backwards, like something had forced its way through. The tracks behind me stretched into darkness, leading nowhere. And then I saw it, a mirror, standing alone at the far end of the platform. It wasn't attached to anything, just there, waiting. I stepped closer, my breath uneven. My reflection wasn't right. It was me, but not me. My face was too pale, my eyes too wide. My chest was rising and falling too fast, like the version of me in the mirror was panicking more than I was. I took another step. The reflection didn't move. I stopped breathing. It was still staring at me. Then slowly it smiled. Not my smile. Not natural. Too wide. Too sharp. The lights above me flickered hard, buzzing so loud it felt like my skull was vibrating. And then, the reflection took a step forward, not in the mirror, into my world. I stumbled back, slamming into one of the rusted turnstiles. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped out of the glass, its movements smooth and wrong at the same time. It looked exactly like me, except its eyes were black, like the windows on the train. It tilted its head, that wide, stretched smile never changing. "You were never supposed to leave," it whispered. My lungs locked. My legs felt like concrete. The lights flickered again, and suddenly it was right in front of me. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I jumped the broken turnstiles, bolting for the only tunnel leading away from the platform. My footsteps splashed against the wet floor, my breath ragged. The whispering returned, except now it wasn't just around me. It was in my head. Run, 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 run. I kept going, forcing my legs to move faster. The tunnel twisted and turned, the ground sloping upward now. Maybe this was the way out. Maybe I could still. A hand grabbed my shoulder. I screamed, twisting away, barely managing to stay on my feet. The thing that looked like me was still smiling, but now its mouth was too big. It opened wider, and wider, and wider. The walls around me shook. The whole tunnel rumbled. A deep, guttural sound like the subway itself was alive. Then, the ground collapsed beneath me. I fell. Everything went black. I woke up somewhere else. At first, I thought I was still falling. My stomach felt weightless, like I was trapped in that split second between dropping and hitting the ground. But I was lying down. The air was thick, warm. It smelled wrong, like damp earth and something else, something rotten. I opened my eyes. Darkness. Not the kind you get in a normal room with the lights off. This was deeper, heavier. Like the kind you get when you close your eyes. Except mine were open. I reached for my phone. The screen flickered to life, the dim glow barely illuminating the space around me. The battery was low, 10%. I sat up wincing. My body ached all over, my limbs heavy, like I'd been lying here for hours. Or maybe longer. The floor beneath me was wet stone, cold, uneven. I wasn't in a subway tunnel anymore. I pointed my phone's flashlight ahead, the beam cutting through the dark. The walls were rough, carved out of rock like some kind of old mine shaft. But there were no tracks, no support beams. Just a single tunnel stretching forward. A whisper echoed behind me. I twisted around, breath caught in my throat. Nothing. Just more darkness. The whisper came again. This time, it was closer. I got to my feet fast, my heartbeat slamming in my ears. My body protested, my legs shaky, but I forced myself to move. I wasn't staying here. I walked forward, my steps uneven. The tunnel twisted and turned, the ground sloping upward. That was good. That meant I was going up, toward the surface. The whispering followed. Not behind me anymore. Above me. I stopped. Slowly, I lifted my phone's light toward the ceiling. There were holes up there. Small, jagged openings in the rock. They looked unnatural, like something had clawed through the stone, and inside those holes, eyes, wide, blinking, too many of them, watching me. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting, my hand slammed over my mouth to keep myself from making a sound. The eyes didn't move. They just stared. The whispering was coming from them. I took a slow step backward. The tunnel behind me was different now. The walls weren't rock anymore. They were smooth, metal, subway walls. The air smelled stale, electric. I turned. The tunnel stretched ahead, except now, there were tracks beneath my feet, and in the distance, just barely visible in my flickering flashlight. A train was coming, but it wasn't moving right. It wasn't gliding along the rails. It was crawling. The metal twisted, the wheels clawing forward, like the train itself was alive. The headlights flickered like dying eyes, and the closer it got, the more I saw. Hands. Hundreds of them, gripping the outside. Some too small, some too big. All of them pushing, dragging the train forward. The doors opened before it even stopped. The inside was dark. Waiting. A voice whispered from inside. Into the line. I turned to run, but the tunnel behind me was gone. Just a wall. Solid cold. No way out. I turned back. The train doors stood open, yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. A single figure stood inside. It looked just like me. Same clothes. Same height. Except its face was still blurred. It lifted one hand and waved. The whispering became laughter. The tunnel shook. The ground rumbled beneath me. The wall behind me started closing in, pushing me forward. I had no choice. I stepped onto the train. The doors slammed shut behind me. The doors locked behind me with a sound that felt too final, like a vault ceiling shut. I was back on the train, but it wasn't the same. The seats were torn apart, stuffing spilling onto the floor. The windows were fogged over, smeared with something that looked greasy like fingerprints, but too big, too many. The overhead lights flickered, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. And I wasn't alone. The other me stood a few rows ahead, still smiling, still blurred. Its face flickered, shifting like a bad TV signal. 1 second, its head tilted too far to the side. The next, it snapped back perfectly straight. It lifted a hand and pointed at the seat across from it. A quiet invitation. I didn't move. The train lurched forward, nearly knocking me off my feet. The movement was wrong. Not smooth, not gliding on rails, but shuddering, groaning, like something dragging itself through a tunnel that wasn't made for it. I grabbed onto a pole, heart hammering. The overhead screen flickered again. Next stop, home. But this time, the letters didn't change. For the first time, the train actually felt like it was taking me somewhere. The other me kept watching, waiting. The whispering had stopped now, replaced by something worse, breathing. Slow, steady. Not mine. I forced myself to look away, to scan the car. The doors at the end of the aisle were locked. The windows were too fogged up to see outside. I needed a way out. I turned back. The seat across from the other me wasn't empty anymore. Someone was sitting there. No, not someone. Something. I don't know how to describe it. My brain refused to process it properly. It wasn't a shape, not a face, just an absence of space, like a hole where something should have been. It turned toward me, and suddenly I was somewhere else. I was sitting in a subway station, not the one I'd started in, not Ashbury. This one was clean, bright. There were people around me, sitting on benches, standing near the edge of the platform. The overhead speakers crackled, an automated voice announcing train schedules. My heart raced. I turned, looking at the people around me. Their faces were normal. Their clothes were modern. They looked real. I was back. Somehow I was back in the real world. I let out a shaky breath and reached for my phone. The battery was still low, but the signal was back. The time made sense. Everything was normal. I stood up, my legs weak. The relief nearly made me collapse. I was about to step forward, to walk toward the exit, when I noticed something. The people around me, they weren't moving. They were frozen. A man on a bench had his coffee cup halfway to his lips, but he wasn't drinking. A woman near the platform edge was mid-step, one foot slightly lifted, like she'd been walking before everything stopped. I turned slowly. No one blinked. No one breathed. And then, at the far end of the platform, I saw myself, standing near the station exit, watching, not blurred anymore, not smiling, just staring, waiting. The lights overhead flickered. The frozen people shifted slightly, like a film reel skipping a frame. I took a step back. The train doors behind me slid open. Cold air rushed out, making the hair on my arms stand up. I turned. Inside the train, the seats were clean again. The windows were clear. The overhead sign read something different now. Last chance. I turned back toward the station exit. The other me was gone, but in its place, there was a shadow, something tall, too tall. It stretched upward, its head touching the ceiling, its arms too long, its fingers twitching like it was waiting for me to make a choice. The train hummed behind me. The station lights flickered harder. I had seconds. I had to choose. Stay in the station, where time had stopped, or get back on the train. I made my choice. The second I stepped through the doors, they slammed shut behind me. The train shuddered forward, faster this time. The lights inside stayed bright, steady. The windows were still clear for now. I turned toward the doors, heart pounding. The station outside vanished in a blur. And then, in the reflection of the window, I saw something running alongside the train. The thing outside the train was keeping up with me. I could barely see it in the reflection, just a shape, a blur of twisted limbs and impossible angles, flickering in and out of existence like a bad signal. It wasn't running. It was gliding, moving too smoothly, too fast. My hands clenched the pole. The train kept gaining speed, the overhead lights buzzing loudly. I turned away from the window. I didn't want to see it anymore. The screen above the doors flickered. Next stop. Final stop. The train jolted, metal screeching, the overhead lights flickering wildly now. The air felt thicker, like the whole car was pressing in around me. Then, the whispering came back. Not from the tunnel, from inside the train. I turned slowly. The seats weren't empty anymore. Figures sat in them, motionless, their faces hidden in the flickering light. They weren't blurred like before. They were just wrong. Too tall, too stretched. Their arms resting in their laps, their heads tilted slightly to the side, like they were listening. Listening to me. The whispering grew louder. I stepped back toward the doors, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gulps. One of the figures turned its head slightly. Then another, and another. A dozen of them, all turning toward me. A shudder ran through the train. The windows cracked slightly. The seats groaned, like the figures were about to stand up. The doors at the far end of the car slammed open. A dark hallway stretched beyond them, longer than it should have been. It didn't lead to another train car. It led somewhere else. And at the end of that hallway, me. I was standing there, perfectly still, watching. The figures in the seats twitched. Their hands tightened into fists. The whispering turned into a low, static hum. The train was slowing down. I looked at the screen. Final stop. Home. I turned back toward the doors. The hallway was closer now. My other self was standing at the entrance. Not smiling. Not moving. Waiting. The whispering rose into a chorus. And then, the train stopped. The doors slid open. Not to a station. Not to a tunnel. To a city. My city. Empty. No cars. No people. Just a quiet street stretching into the distance. A way out. I hesitated. The whispering stopped. Then, from behind me, a soft breath. "You stop." I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the doors and hit the pavement hard, the cold air burning my lungs. The train behind me hissed, its lights flickering. Then, it was gone. No screeching metal. No sound. Just gone. The city around me was eerily silent. Too quiet. No wind. No distant traffic. I pulled out my phone. It was morning now. The time was normal. The date was right. My battery was at 1%. I turned in a slow circle, my breath unsteady. Everything looked normal, but it felt wrong. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. I looked down at my shoes. The soles were wet, and in the puddle beneath me, my reflection was still smiling.